How does Putin and Trump, how do they both come out of these negotiations looking like they've won? Because I think deep down, Trump doesn't want to look like the president who lost Ukraine. I think that's something that's on Trump's mind and something that could down the road be something he doesn't want to be tied to if he offers too many concessions. And then I also think that Putin has been so clear since the beginning of the war that Russia will achieve its goals. And he made it very clear. He stated them. Everyone knows him that's watching this, I'm sure. How do they both come out looking like they've won?
They do that by putting a lot of lipstick on the pig of defeat for Ukraine, the West, and for the United States.
Hi, my name is Edmund Demarche. I'm the editor of the Trends Journal. I'm here today with Ray Mcgovern, the former CIA analyst and author at raymcgovern.com. That's very easily searchable. Just type in raymcgovern.com. Ray, thank you for joining me.
You're welcome, Ed.
We were just talking briefly about how it's hard to keep up and analyze things going on in Ukraine because of the developing situation. This was an interview, and obviously a lot has happened since then. This is an interview with Matt Whitaker. He's the NATO, he's the U.S. ambassador to NATO. And I thought that this was such an interesting interaction. And given what happens since then, I'd love to just hear your opinion on what he's saying here.
It's impossible to get in the mind of Vladimir Putin because it's sick and twisted and probably not logical. But, I'm guessing that he doesn't want to take on the most powerful military in the world, which is the United States of America.
Now, that was less than 48 hours before Trump was talking about meeting Putin and looking like they're making some big diplomatic wins. Can you explain what's going on in his administration and how someone could say something like that so soon before peace talks advance potentially?
Well, Whitaker is not very different from most of the pundits and analysts and TV commentators. They can't get used to the idea that Trump says one thing one day and another thing the other day. But the backdrop for all this, and it's hard for people to be convinced about this, but Trump wants to end the damn war in Ukraine. Every chance he gets, he says, it's not my war. And Putin yesterday quoted him saying, "Это не война Байдена. Это война Байдена." Okay, it's the war of Biden. Okay, so this is the backdrop. And it's come through very clearly when we finally have a readout from yesterday's conversations between Witkoff, Trump's personal representative, and his fifth meeting with President Putin. That is highly unusual, okay? In other words, if you look at the right sources and you don't try to follow Trump from day to day, or if you listen to what the Russians themselves are saying, when Trump says something outlandish, their spokesman, usually Dmitry Peskov, who's a spokesperson for Putin, says, look, people get emotionally overwrought. Now let's keep our eye on the ball here. And most recently, just 2 days ago, it was a major clue that everybody missed, except those of us who followed the arcane discipline of reading what leading Kremlin people say. Here it is. His name is Grigory Karasin. He's head of the International Affairs Committee of the Duma, the Russian parliament. He says, look, this is what we need to do, okay? In all this business about Trump and sanctions, be calm, patient, composed, and resist emotional responses. Now, let's wait until Witkoff talks to our president. I mean, in contrast to the quote again, in contrast to the loud statements and deadlines about ending the war and for solving the war and new sanctions, for God's sake, let's wait until Witkoff talks to our president. Can you understand that? Says the head of the International Affairs Committee of the Duma. Now, his counterpart in the Senate, the Russian Senate, said pretty much the same thing just 4 days before. And she also said, look, gentlemen, she's a very, very powerful woman. She says, gentlemen, now that it's acknowledged by official documents that Russiagate was a hoax, that Obama threw out $35 Russian diplomats from the United States, confiscated our property, closed the consulate in San Francisco, all on a hoax. Now, gentlemen, maybe it's time for you to set that aright and make some recompense and sort of change your policy. So all I'm saying is that if you watch Kremlin statements and you follow their guidance, for God's sake, and not don't take Trump seriously, then you're not surprised at what happened yesterday. I think I was doing an interview 1 hour after all this broke, and I said, look, this, in my view, means the end of the cockamamie sanctions that Trump is threatening to levy on Russia after Russia is going to solve the Ukrainian thing by Friday. Now, I have no confirmation of that, but the logic of the situation says if they're going to meet next week, I don't think Trump's going to levy sanctions on Russia. So just to finish up here and put some context on this, first thing I did this morning when I woke up, not too long ago, mind you, I stay up late, was to look at what Putin said this morning, okay? It's real easy. He was at a press set-to, where they call it a gaggle, I guess, in the United States. Okay, he's asked, who initiated that meeting? The meeting you're going to have with President Trump? Putin. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. It's no longer relevant. Okay. Putin. We have many friends willing to help us set up this meeting. The President of the United Arab Emirates. The exact venue has not been decided, but the UAE would be one suitable place. Okay. Now, next question. This is the important one. What about Zelensky? You said you would never talk to Zelensky, or you said you wouldn't talk to him until he agrees that, number one, he's pretty illegitimate, and number two, you'd talk to that, I was going to say, that bastard, if he showed some flexibility. So what about the news that you're going to meet with him, Putin? Well, I've said that we have no objection in principle, but there are certain conditions that must be in place first. Quote, unfortunately, we are still far from that point, end quote. So yesterday, Trump expressed hope, his actual expectation that after Putin and Trump met, the three of them would meet. No Europeans, okay? Nobody could muss things up, okay? The three of them would meet and figure out what to do. Zelensky says, all right, well, maybe that's okay. Putin says, that's still not okay under the circumstances. Now, we also have the readout from Ushakov, who is Putin's right-hand man on all this, but I'll spare you further verbiage from me unless you're interested.
I was interested in your take on how does Putin and Trump, how do they both come out of these negotiations looking like they've won? Because I think deep down, Trump doesn't want to look like the president who lost Ukraine. I think that's something that's on Trump's mind and something that could down the road be something he doesn't want to be tied to if he offers too many concessions. And then I also think that Putin has been so clear since the beginning of the war that Russia will achieve its goals. And he made it very clear. He stated them. Everyone knows him that's watching this, I'm sure. How do they both come out looking like they've won?
They do that by putting a lot of lipstick on the pig of defeat for Ukraine, the West, and for the United States. Let me go back to what President Obama said in one of his more lucid moments. In 2015, that's 10 years ago, right? He said, look, we have to be really careful of what we extend as our core interests. What are existential threats to us? Ukraine is no threat to us. Ukraine is an existential threat to Russia. Okay. Therefore, the worst thing we could possibly do is to give the Ukrainians the idea that they could win a war against a much more powerful Russia. Okay. That's why I'm not giving them offensive arms. Let's be careful. They can't win a war against a much more powerful Russia right on their border. Look at just all the statistics. It would be foolish for them to start a war against Russia, and foolish more still, if you will, for us to support that. Now, there was a deputy foreign minister working for Obama at the time, a deputy secretary of state, I should say. And this is what he said, Mr. President, you're exactly right. because every weapon we gave to the Ukrainians, the Russians could match, and then they could double, and they could triple, and they could quadruple. Exact quote. Okay. So you're right, Mr. President. We should avoid doing that. Now, do you know the name of that Deputy Secretary of State under Obama? His name was Tony Blinken. Yeah, then he comes into office as Secretary of State to the aging, oblivious, Russia-hating Biden, and Biden says, "Can we do this?" And Tony Blinken, "Of course we can. We're the most exceptional country in the world. We're indispensable. We're we get arms up to Kazoo. And by the way, my friends will profiteer on the making and the selling of all these arms. And now we have what we have 3 years later, a disaster, which Trump now is in the position of trying to clean up. Now, Trump says in every remark on Ukraine, it's Biden's war. It's not my war. I approach it from a humanitarian perspective. I don't want more Ukrainians killed. Now, you have to greet that with a degree of cynicism, because if Ukrainians didn't look more like us, well, let me just say that Palestinians, most of them don't look more like us. And it doesn't matter to Trump that they keep getting killed by the thousands every week, So it's confected in a way, but it's very powerful arguing points to the American populace. Okay, look, this was Biden's war. It was stupid. Biden said so himself. Blinken came in and persuaded, Obama said so himself. Blinken came in and persuaded Biden to do it anyway. Let's get the hell out of there. Now, is there a win-win situation, which was your question? Not really. I mean, we can put a lot of cosmetics on this. Now, the way I read this is that Trump, through Witkoff, said, look, we're in a bind. We got no more weapons. The Europeans have no more weapons. We can't possibly support Ukraine the way Biden did. So we realize that. But we also realize that, we need some lipstick on this pig. We need some kind of talks in and of themselves, a great big move forward, right? Okay. And the talks have to result eventually in satisfying your demand, Mr. Putin, that Ukraine will never be in NATO. And then we work out the rest of the stuff, a cordon sanitaire, a buffer zone, and all, because we have core interests there. And as Obama admitted 10 years ago, you don't have any core interests. So let's figure out how to dress this thing up so it's a negotiated settlement where, in effect, the Russians have won. They're willing to stop before taking all of Ukraine. That's an important thing. The Russians stopped in April of 2022. Okay, so when you say the Russians won't stop before they take all of Ukraine, that's crazy. That would be their Vietnam. A lot of the Ukrainians in the West hate Russians. Okay, and not only that, of course, if they stop before taking even the 4 provinces that they have now, then what's the argument that they're going to go on and take Poland and then the Baltic states, like Biden explicitly said? So there's lots of room here for the American people to become educated. And, not many people like Trump. And I have to confess that my wife always says, look, Ray, tell them what you think of Trump. I'm not going to do that on this program. So anyway, there's plenty of leeway here. Putin, in my view, has shown a readiness to concede. Concede? Putin? Concession? Yeah. He's meeting with Trump, for God's sake. That in of itself is a big deal. Now, they'll figure out some way to deal with Zelensky, whether he's there at a trilateral meeting or not. And I have more hope today in the wake of what happened yesterday than I have had for many months.
You touched on Donald Trump stressing to reporters that this is not his war. I'm just going to play a couple of clips. This is Trump addressing reporters from recently. I'm going to play 2 of them.
Keeping that 10 to 12-day deadline that you had given Russia after today's talks?
Yeah, we're pretty much getting close to it right now, but we're having very serious talks right now about getting out of Ukraine, getting it settled, getting it ended. Should have never started, would have never started. If I were president, it would have never started. This is Biden's war. This is not my war. I'm here to get us out of it. It's a mess, and I'm here to get us out. I haven't heard that when you say about 60-year-old men and, et cetera. But this is Biden's war, and we're working very hard to get us out. I stopped 5 wars in the last 5 months, actually, and I'd like this to be the 6th, frankly, and that doesn't even include Iran, which obliterating their nuclear haul, because they would have had nuclear weapons within 2 months. But stopped a lot of wars. You just take a look at the ones just over the last 2 or 3 months. It's been amazing. This is the one I'm trying to stop. This is the one we're working hardest on. The other ones I stopped within a matter of days, almost every one of them.
So I guess Trump is referring to wars that he started with the Houthis and with Iran. But back to the point that he made about Ukraine and how it's not his war. I've heard analysts say that Trump isn't so innocent as he puts on when it comes to Ukraine, because you mentioned before, Obama, he didn't provide offensive weapons to Ukraine. It was Donald Trump who gave Ukraine offensive weapons during his last administration, which might have given maybe Kyiv the confidence to or stand up, or maybe Europe the confidence for Kyiv to stand up to Russia. Do you think that Trump is as innocent when he says that this is not his war as he's saying? Not that it even matters if he brings an end to it necessarily, but what would you say to that question?
Well, first, Ed, I'd say not that it even matters.
Mhm.
Everyone learns, you know.
Mhm.
Everyone learns that what Obama said was true. Okay. Now, what Trump has done vis-a-vis Russia, under the pressure of these people that were saying, you're in Putin's pocket there, Mr. Trump, all this stuff. The worst thing he did was to get out of the only treaty in the history of mankind, of which I'm aware, that destroyed an existing class of missiles, medium range, intermediate range ballistic missiles, thousands of which were in Europe and in the European part of Russia. That was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which Trump, apparently listening to Bolton or some other person like that, said, "Oh yeah, well, you want us to get out of there, and we'll put missiles in there." Well, the Russians complained bitterly. They said, "Look, you are accusing us of putting missiles like that. Come on, take a look, inspect them. We're not doing that, please." And Trump and of course Biden never did that. And so it was a calculated move to get out of that treaty. Now, again, that treaty was in effect even longer than the ABM treaty, which I helped to negotiate in Moscow in 1972. I was there, okay? And when that was concluded, I said, "Oh, no longer do I have to hide under my desk, damn it," as I did as a kid. Man, I was euphoric. And it lasted for 30 years until George W. Bush, Jr. Bush, got out of it willy-nilly, again, on the advance and the advice of people like John Bolton. So where does that leave us? Well, in other words, Trump is far from innocent, but he's learned a lot of stuff, like what Obama said was true. There's no chance that Ukraine can win this thing, and there's a chance to stop this thing and emerge with a certain better odor than would otherwise be possible. The realities on the ground is, it is not the case, as the Director of National Intelligence told the President Biden, back in December of 2022. It is not the case that the Russians are running out of ammunition, that they're running out of weaponry, that they have no, quote, no indigenous capability to replace the weapons that they are losing willy-nilly on the front, end quote. Give me a break. I don't know where she summoned that thing up. That wasn't true then, and now it's not true in spades now. So there's no more weapons. That's the thing, okay? Now, the Europeans, can they substitute? No, they can't. Can they buy a lot more new weapons from the U.S.? Yeah, that's the deal. They're going to run out of money too. So the die is cast, and what we're trying to do now is make it appear that this is a negotiated settlement. Nobody wants an unconditional surrender, for God's sake. We know what that brings, right? So there's room for maneuver here, and I just append a little remark. I made a note here. When Trump is asked in that last clip about drafting people 60 years old into the Ukrainian army, Ed, my God, I'm saying, as a father, I have two sons, one of whom is over 60 years old. And my God, I hope he doesn't make it 80 or more than 80. That would include my class, okay, my vintage. So it's crazy. that the Ukrainians are scrubbing the bottom of the barrel, and there's no chance they can win or prevail. The more so that even if Putin, I'm sorry, even if Trump and these Europeans, which I call what I call them, the the three blind men, okay, Starmer, Merz, and Macron. It was interesting yesterday what Trump did after he heard from Witkoff. After he went public, he said, "Oh yeah, by the way, I called the Europeans. I called Starmer. I called Merz. I called the head of Finland. I called the head of Secretary General of NATO. Oh, I forgot to call Macron." Well, he doesn't matter. So I talked to these people. I told them what's going on, and I told them, "Sorry, you're not involved in these trilateral talks if they take place. You're not involved in these bilateral talks. We're going to take care of it ourselves. Yeah, you buy our weapons. You're on deck here. See what you can do. See if you can do what we couldn't do for the last 3 years. We, the United States of America, the most powerful country on the face of the earth."
I remember back when they had their first meeting, the Trump administration officials. I think it was in Saudi Arabia earlier in the year. The CEO of Rheinmetall from Germany came out and said, this is because there were no Europeans at that meeting. And this CEO said, you know, if you're irrelevant on the battlefield and don't have militaries, he was criticizing Europe. You don't get the seat at the table. You're at the kids' table, I think he said. So I guess this shows that Europe is just going to have to live with the outcome of these discussions. Is that how you see it playing out?
Well, the word I was searching for was the coalition of the brain dead. Okay. Now, during Iraq, the war in Iraq, there were statesmen in Europe. There were statesmen leading France, leading Germany. And they saw that this was a cockamamie idea. And they saw there were no weapons of mass destruction or ties between Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda. And they said, we're out of here. And so what did Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, say? Oh, it's old Europe, old Europe. Forget about them, you know. French fries became freedom fries in the Senate. It was crazy, okay? So that's what happened then. Now, these same people there were no statesmen any longer. They were all political hacks that bubble up to the top. Macron, Merz, Starmer, my God, the guy in Finland, the Secretary General of NATO. They're all political hacks. Now, what do they have going for them? Filthy lucre. Now, you mentioned Rheinmetall. Let me tell you just a little vignette here. I remember back around 2013, 2014, when Krauss Maffei, okay, a joint French-German arms manufacturer, was building the common European battle tank, okay? Oh, but they ran into problems. There was no persuasive enemy to build a common European battle tank against. The Russians were not threatening. They were on their back pretty much from what the West had done to them right after they fell apart. And so they were dead in the water. What happens? Oh, the regime in Ukraine is overturned. There's a coup in Kiev in February 2014. Oh, Krauss Maffei back in business. Now, Rheinmetall wanted to steal the rights to the common European battle tank. And so they said, oh, we'll build it. We'll continue to build it. And Krauss Maffei said, we'll sue you in court. It's our order to build it. So what did they do? Well, they settled out of court. You, Krauss Maffei, you build the structure and the wheels and all that. And Rheinmetall, we'll build the rest of this stuff. And hey, we'll be sitting pretty. There's enough money in this thing for all of us. That's what happened. They settled out of court because there was lots of lucre, filthy lucre available. Now, that's only Krauss Maffei or Rheinmetall. There are so many people profiteering, and it's demonstrable, profiteering on the war by the defense-related people here in the United States. That is a scandal. The problem is nobody repeats this or reports it in the press because the press is part of what I call the Mickey Mat. Let me just reiterate that. This is in the dictionary now. The Mickey Mat rhymes with Mickey Mouse a little bit, so you can remember it. Mickey Mat, the military, industrial, congressional, intelligence, media, academia, think tank complex. Now, I have the likes of Stephen Cohen, one of my patrons is a Russian scholar, telling me, you got it all right. That's exactly what it is. It used to be the MIC, the military industrial complex. Now you've added military industrial, congressional, they're in it this deep, okay? Intelligence, they too are in there. Media, academia, think tank. Okay, why do I say media as if it were in all caps? Because media, the media is the cornerstone of all this, okay? If you can't sell this, sell war with Russia, sell Putin as the devil incarnate, it doesn't work. And who owns the media? Who owns the media? The rest of the Mickey man. Okay, so if CBS or NBC or ABC, if they have a portion of their corporation that's telling the news, and that represents, let's say, 5% of their gross proceeds or income, but do you think they might be influenced by the other 95% of the profits? Well, it's not hard to put that to understand that. But since the media is the vehicle by which Americans would be educated to this thing, they are hopelessly brainwashed into thinking that Putin has two horns, that the Russians were responsible for defeating Hillary Clinton in the first place, and now, I hate to say this, Ed, but now the documentary evidence has been made public by the head of the FBI, the head of the National Intelligence System, and the head of the CIA. Americans are still so brainwashed that they are reluctant to believe it, even on the off chance that they hear it or read it or see it.
I know your time is not unlimited, Ray. I appreciate you joining me. I have one more question for you,
Sure.
and I appreciate, and maybe two more if you have time. We recently we were talking about how erratic everything's been with Ukraine, and it was just recently, I think it was on Friday, that Trump got into a little tit for tat with Medvedev, the Russian former Russian president,
Right.
and Trump made that very unusual declaration that he was going to reposition subs. And that looked like a big escalation, or at least that's the way I perceived it. And now that seems like ancient history. All's forgotten that we did that dramatic move. I guess my question to you is, did Russia play the Ukraine war well in that they didn't cross any major red lines, that they never got too aggressive, like they never killed Zelensky? They never attacked his presidential where he lives in Kyiv. Did Russia always keep that in mind, not to escalate too high so they can have an off ramp from the war? And in your opinion, do you think there was anything that Russia could have done in Ukraine that would have gotten a NATO response or a U.S. response, or was that never going to happen?
Well, comparisons are invidious, so I won't compare Putin with other world leaders. But Putin is a cool, calm, and collected fellow, okay? He's perspicacious. He had no choice other than to go into Ukraine. And then he scared the hell out of the Ukrainians with a modest force of 90,000 troops up there near Kiev. The Ukrainians caved. They signed an agreement in Istanbul. We have the agreement, and we have the initials, not the signature. And the head of Britain, Boris Johnson at the time, on behalf of the United States, told Zelensky, don't do that. Don't buy into this. We can still get you into NATO, and we'll support you for as long as it takes, okay? Well, now it's as long as it takes, okay? Now, the Russians always had the advantage. Why Biden would believe his national intelligence director in December of 2022 saying the Russians are running out of ammunition and they can't replace their armament, and why he would believe the head of the CIA in July of the next year, who said Putin has already lost and his army has been discredited for the whole world to see. That was Bill Burns telling Biden, who was in Helsinki at the time, go ahead and say that. Now, just as a codicil here, I couldn't understand this. I mean, where the hell was Bill Burns? Like, even a politicized CIA is not going to tell Bill Burns that Putin is lost. Okay. So I look back. Where was Bill Burns the previous week? Oh, he was in Kiev. And who was he talking to? Oh, he's talking to Zelensky. So I mean, it's not a stretch to say Zelensky said, "Look, Bill, my best friend Bill, tell the president we got it made, man. We're making great success on the battlefield, and your Putin's army has been discredited for the whole world to see." My God! So Bill Burns is taking the word of Zelensky. He goes to Biden, and Biden says in a major speech in the middle of July in Helsinki, yes, the Putin has already lost. So that's the kind of intelligence the U.S. is getting. And Trump, my God, to the degree he says 1 million Russians have been killed, to the degree he says the Russian economy is going, he's being very ill-advised. I hope not by my former colleagues. I hope it's these other people like what's his name, Kellogg and the likes of that are telling him all that. So let me getting back to your question. What was it?
my question was Russia smart in how it waged the war in Ukraine, that it didn't cross any kind of a red line, it wasn't too aggressive, it never killed Zelensky, it never tried to, at least that we know about, for sure. Did Russia have that in mind all along? Were they constrained in Ukraine because they wanted an end to the war, and that's the way that they could have achieved that?
Yes, the answer is unequivocally yes. Now, when you talk about Russians targeting hospitals or kindergartens or all that, that's all bollocks, as the British like to say. They've been very, very careful in targeting military-related institutions, and we can prove that. Okay, so after a major attack overnight, like 100 drones and some other missilery, okay, and when the Ukrainians complain, they say, last night, 5 people were killed and 7 people were wounded. Oh my God, that's not targeting civilian establishments, okay? So this is not defending the attacks on these things. It's explaining that they are very clearly targeted. And so, yeah, so the answer to your question is yes, Putin has been very careful. The only time he raised the nuclear issue, and he did raise it, and that surprised me a little bit, was after Zelensky himself a week before the war said, we're going to get nuclear weapons too, or we're thinking about getting nuclear weapons. Well, that's a no-no, for God's sake. And Putin thought he had to remind people about what that would mean, okay? What that would mean would be the end of that part of Europe at very least. And so this Medvedev, he's the bad cop, okay? Even our vice president, J.D. Vance, has said, look, don't take Medvedev seriously. He's the bad cop. He doesn't speak for Putin. And that's true. Putin lets Medvedev, who was in Putin's position as president of Russia just about a decade ago. So he's a big deal. But Medvedev is a fulminator, okay? And what he talked about was really dangerous. What he said was, look, we've come to a point where the dead hand might be applied. Dead hand, my God. That is retaliation by machine. In other words, the first example you have of some kind of possible strategic attack, automatically, the rest of that attacking country is pulverized, and so too is the other country. So you have world war. So Medvedev invokes this thing, and then of course, my God, this is terrible. What is Medvedev doing? Now, in defense of many of my colleagues who are primarily military analysts, this could not be bigger. I mean, invoking this thing in these conditions is really, really important in terms of military capabilities. And that's what military analysts have to be exclusively or almost exclusively concerned about. Political tensions, that's our shtick, okay? And we would say, yeah, this was a very notable thing, but the Russians have no idea that they want to do this. All they're trying to do is warn the United States, look, we have these damn weapons. Don't provoke us into this kind of thing. And the guy to do that, of course, is Medvedev. By the way, his name in Russian means bear, okay, Medvedev. So he's the big bear, even though he's kind of little. And I have to look at these things in a perspicacious way. As the head of the Duma Committee on Foreign Relations says, look, be calm, take this thing in stride. The U.S. will realize it has no vital interest, no core interest in Ukraine. Besides that, it got no arms. Besides that, the Europeans can't possibly supply enough arms because the U.S. would have to. So that's why the Europeans are saying, oh, we got to prepare for World War III. But probably won't happen till 29 because that will give us enough time to prepare. So they have an agreement with the Russians? No, please don't do that. Please don't. Give me
What
a
does this
break, Ed.
mean? What is this last question? I know you have to go. What does this mean for the future of NATO? Because NATO, the countries there just announced that they'll increase their spending by 5%. If this Ukraine war settled and there's peace in the valley, first of all, how will this leave NATO? What's the future of NATO if Russia achieves some of its goals? And why would a country like, let's say, Spain spend 5% on its military, an increase? If this is the result of this conflict, this war.
Yeah. Well, that 5% is illusory. They don't have the money. They have social problems that won't quit. The last thing they're going to be able to do, and I'm talking about the Brits and the Germans and the French as well, last thing they'll be able to do is to meet that 5% goal, okay? So that's illusory. How did that come about? They gave Trump that because at the last NATO summit about 2 months ago, they had to give Trump something to crow about because the rest of the deal was no Ukraine in NATO. Did they say that? No, you have to be familiar with how the Russians do things, okay? And how the Americans do things also. Last year, the summit communique said Ukraine has a irreversible path toward membership in NATO. Okay. This year's communique said zero. No, that's like, well, I have to tell you, you don't have to be an old Kremlinologist like me to say, wait a second, they didn't say that this year and they said it last year. Does that mean something? Well, it does. It means NATO is finished, for God's sake. There are so many cleavages, so many canyons splitting people in NATO that I predicted after this last NATO summit that it might be the last one. Okay, the one scheduled for Tirana in Albania for next year. I'd be surprised if they all show up. Okay, so it's rent asunder. It's their own damn fault. They have secretaries general who do the bidding of Washington who flex the knee at every call from Washington. They're shown to be puppets. And the last thing I'll just mention, when I talk about NATO membership being the real bête noire here, the real cause for all this, well, it's not only that the Russians have said that, it's not only that most people admit that now, but back 2 years ago, appearing before the EU Parliament, the Secretary General of NATO, what was it, Jens Stoltenberg, previous president of Norway, he said, and I quote, the Russians, they gave us a treaty. They said, sign this treaty, which says no Ukraine in NATO because they didn't want NATO enlargement. And so we said, no. And so they said, okay, if you say no, we're going to have to invade Ukraine. And so we said no again, and they invaded Ukraine. Now, Ed, he said that after about 1 million people had been killed because NATO was unwilling to say, okay, no Ukraine membership. And this is the Secretary General of NATO. And he went on to brag. This shows the caliber of mentality in head of NATO. He says, besides, he says, Putin wanted no enlargement of NATO, and look what he got. He got Finland, he got Sweden, so we enlarged NATO anyhow. Meanwhile, as I said before, the cream of Ukrainian youth been killed or wounded really badly. These kinds of people should not be in any kind of positions of power. They are. I think Trump knows what caliber they are. He's not going to be coerced by what they think. He's happy to sell military arms to them, of course, filthy lucre. But the coalition of the brain dead. I'm talking Starmer, Merz, and Macron. Well, they are the epitome of the opposite of people that they had in Germany and France, at least, before the war in Iraq, who said, this is cockamamie. We don't want any part of that. And of course, Rumsfeld called them the old Europe. Well, bring me back to the old Europe, for God's sake. the sooner we get some statesmen in there, the better.
Well, Ray McGovern, thank you for joining the Trends Journal. I appreciate that. I would encourage everyone to, once again, check out raymcgovern.com, raymcgovern.com. And also you can find Ray on X, just the Ray McGovern with the his handle. And you'll find out updates, and he's a frequent user, and it's fun to follow. Ray, thank you so much for joining the Trends Journal. I appreciate it.
You're most welcome, Ed.